Welcome to Podcasting Unlocked, a mini-series with me, host Paul Banks. I've been podcasting for 5 years and I've met so many business owners who want to get involved with podcasting and just don't know where to start. They don't know where to host it, how to host it, what setup they need, what equipment they need, how to manage their guests, and have no idea about process. If that sounds like you, this show's for you. Come join us each week for the next few weeks as we discuss podcasting unlocked.
Hello. Just listening to that intro makes me feel tired. Wow, we've got a repeated sound. There we go. We're discussing podcasting unlocked. Sorry, I don't know whether that's come over in the I'm throwing myself there. Technology, trying to be too clever. Yeah, I just feel tired listening to that. Podcasting, where do we even start with it? We're covering off in this mini-series. This is part 3 of the mini-series. We're going to take a break next week for half-term holidays. I know some of you have got 2 weeks holidays, you lucky people. Depending on how you look at it. And yeah, this series is about discussing how you can get started with podcasting. If you're on the fence and you want to get moving with it, how can we help you get there? Without needing other people's support, just on your own steam, get things up and running. What do you need to consider? Where do you need to go? This week, we're talking about getting you set up. It's a very important topic because it's the bit that most people don't appreciate fully until it's too late. So first things first, you've got an idea in your head for a podcast. You've decided you're going to go ahead with it. We talked last week about some of the challenges that you might face. We talked the week before about some of the benefits that you might get. This week is about getting you off the ground. All of the bits and pieces behind the scenes that you need to consider in order to get moving. And in the next episode, we're going to talk about the technologies that you need to be aware of and how they might help you, right? I'm not going to go to those today. We are just purely going to look at the research that you need to do, the things that you need to consider, and the assets and content that you might need to create in advance before you can even get started. So the first thing first is to carefully consider who your target audience is for the podcast. And they should align, I predominantly find, with your business ideal audience also. Doesn't have to be, because here's the kicker. As we've discussed in the last 2 episodes, one of the main benefits of running your own podcast is the ability to organically mingle with people who might be either good business partners for you, might be great clients for you, or a mix of both. So the important thing really is considering who you would need or want to have on as a guest and aiming the podcast at giving them a podium to stand on. The byproduct of that is you still need to make it attractive to the audience. Otherwise, your guests won't want to appear because you're not getting through to your target audience for them. And bonus points if you can manage to make both work, right? If you can manage to have conversations with your ideal clients whilst benefiting your ideal clients, then you're going to win all round. So that's the important thing to consider. The second thing to consider is you need to be super passionate about what it is that you do. Because if you're not passionate, you're going to dry up. You're going to get to a point where you don't want to talk about it anymore and the podcast is going to flop. Again, we covered that last week. I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. Then we start to get into what are you going to need in hand in order to get set up as a podcast, right? So most people who launch a podcast want to get working with YouTube. They want to have an audio podcast version, and they probably want to host it on their website, right? So when we think about those things, I'm going to say something that's going to surprise you that you haven't thought of yet, is you're going to need some graphic design work doing. Now, these days you can get ChatGPT or one of the language models to create you a logo, which is good enough, right? It doesn't need to be all singing and all dancing, because hands on heart, they just need to be able to recognize your logo. They don't necessarily need a connection at this point with it. But bear in mind, once you've created it, it's really tiring and hard to find all the places that logo has filtered itself into down the line when the podcast's starting to move on and you want to create something a bit more professional. So I'd heavily advise, if you've got the cash in hand before you start your podcast, invest in a decent logo and invest in banners to fit your YouTube channel, your podcast hosting platform, and your website to identify what it is, a bit more information about your podcast, right? So the logo is just the instantly recognizable visual cue. Your banner tells people a little bit more about the energies and the problems that the podcast talks about. It's got a bit more of the brand feel to it, but it helps identify that. And you can just do that with Canva, right? I did when I first started my first few podcasts. We just did everything in Canva. We did it ourselves because hands on heart, not a lot of people see that, right? It's not the main thing that people want to go to, but if you don't have one or it's poorly created, people are going to notice that and view your podcast in a similar vein. Getting beyond that, we need to have a description of the podcast. And I'm a big fan of making that a vision, right? What do you want to achieve with the podcast? And it's not just, oh, we interview people about this topic. That's great. That's part of it. There's an element of that. But tell a story. Make people want to watch your podcast or listen to your podcast. Give it some narrative. Make them curious. Make it a bit polarizing, right? Like, what are you going to learn from this that you won't get in any other podcast? What is the format to an extent? We interview people, we go and talk to business owners, we surprise people with conversations they don't expect, we ask them questions they're not used to answering. What is your unique USP for the podcast? Which brings me then to another point of consideration. Before you can create that description, you need to understand in great detail what it is that's going to help your podcast stand out from the crowd. Because there are millions of podcasts out there. We've already discussed this. And you don't want to blend in with all the other series and podcasts that are out there. You want to have something that's unique to you, that will draw the right people to you for their aha moment, right? So again, as with everything, I advocate for using ChatGPT or large language models to ideate on these things and brainstorm them. Ask them to ask you questions. Tell it, I want you to act as a serious senior podcast producer, a creative marketing director, whatever you want to give the job title of that for. And I want you to ask me questions that will help me set up my podcast, that will help me create a podcast that resonates with people. I want it to be different from the crowd. I want to be this, I want to be that. Give it as much information as you already know and have figured out for yourself, but then get it to ask you questions. And I firmly believe that just the process of getting it to ask you the questions helps you answer the questions in your own head. And it will ask you questions that you haven't thought about. Some of them will be irrelevant. Some of them will be much more applicable. And you get to a point where you've got a short description, maybe 100 words or so, that succinctly tells a story of why you've started the podcast, who you're aiming it at, and why people should care what it is that your guests have to say. And bear in mind that, you might not have guests. It might just be you running a podcast. So you've got to be talking about specific topics each week. How long is it going to be? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? All those sorts of things you need to think about before you even launch that podcast. One of the other things that you also need to do is to consider how you're going to attract your guests to the show. I've talked about this before, and whilst I'm not going to get into platforms, you need to have guest management kind of drilled into what it is that you're doing. So building up a list of people who would be interested to come on your show even before you've launched it properly. You want to get 4 or 5 episodes in the bag, recorded and done before you launch the episodes, so that you've got that buffer zone in case anything happens, in case sickness, illness, holidays, family situations. There's all sorts of things that might cause a problem. So first up, make sure you identify your why for your podcast. Why are you doing this? What do you want to achieve? What if you could wave a magic wand? How are you going to impact on the business world with the podcast? What do you want people to take away from it? You need to think about a media kit. So when we talked about the logo previously, it's obvious that it should be something that's different to your business, right? A lot of people try and do too close to their business and then getting the two confused. And the beauty of doing it separately is you can then set up a different LinkedIn page, a different website if you want, that points people to your own website. You can set up a different YouTube channel, and the two streams of content don't get mixed up together in the middle too much. So that's a beautiful bonus to having a distinct brand for your podcast. And why not, to start with, why not have your own business be the sponsor for your podcast? It helps just kind of get people thinking about your brand a bit more. And when I said at the beginning about considering who your guests and audience are going to be, you also need to consider how you're going to find your guests for your show. And for a lot of us, that's going to be LinkedIn, I would imagine, right? That you can do it through email, you can do it through LinkedIn. And people, when we first start inviting people to our podcast, it's a bit daunting because you're asking of people. And generally asking things of people before you've given anything to them means you're going to get a lot of no's or just ignored. So what I do specifically for my podcast is I offer the guests 2 or 3 clips at least. It's generally 10 or 15 for me because that's what we do, right? Like we repurpose things. So invest in a platform that repurposes video where you can promise your guests, if you come onto my podcast, we will make a song and a dance about you. We will promote you. We will do X, Y, and Z each week to make sure that you get in front of my audience. And in return, I'd like you to do a bit of promotion yourself. So get our podcast in front of your audience. It'll raise your credibility, raise your authority with them, and it'll help you get noticed. Hopefully we can land you some clients as a result, right? Like win-win. Everybody wants that. My point being is that reciprocity that you gain from giving them something from being on the show means that they're much more likely to say yes, much more likely to promote your show to their audience, and you make it easy for them. Now, this is the key to what I'm getting down to, right? If you do all of this work in advance of launching your podcast, you make it easy for your guests to become part of the show. You make it easy for your audience to understand why they should listen. And you make it easy for yourself to carry things forward because you've already done all of the heavy lifting up front. You're not getting caught up in things like, oh, I thought the podcast would be this, but we've ended up doing that. And you've streamlined your process. So always think about these things up front before you get started. I know if you've made the decision to get started on a podcast, you probably just want to launch it, you just want to get it going. Like, oh my God, if I don't record and release something this week, I'll never do it. And there is some truth to that. I do understand that thinking. The good news is a lot of these things that I'm asking you to do or consider aren't really time consuming. They're just not very much fun for a lot of people, right? So you procrastinate on them a bit more than you should. But actually, when you get down to just creating them, it doesn't take that long to do. It just takes a bit of time and effort. And going back to kind of inviting your guests on the show, if you send them a nice, simple email that says, it can be templated to an extent, right? Template the email. Tell them what they're going to get out of it in the template, right? As a guest on the show, I'd love you to come on. There's a paragraph there that needs to be written by hand that goes, do you know what? I've looked at your profile. I've looked at who you are. I've looked at your business. I think you'd be a great example for the podcast because, right? That because is what gets you the yes. Then underneath that, here's what you'll get in return. So I'm asking, but I'm giving. And if you do both, you'll get a lot of yeses, you'll get a lot of responses. So you also then need to consider, and I'd highly encourage everyone to do this, a waiting list to be on the podcast. That waiting list can be like a Jot form, it can be a Microsoft Forms, anything simple. Just keep it really simple, where your guests can register their bio, their name, their email, their website that they want referenced in the show notes. Any of the information that you might need to create content at the end, ask them to provide it up front. That does 2 things. it encourages them to, it discourages people who aren't really serious about being a guest on the show. You will get a lot of people who say, yes, I want to be a podcast guest, but on the day comes up, actually, they just don't care about it enough to turn up, and they waste your time, they waste the time that you spent getting their graphics and promotional materials set up, etc., etc. So it's important there's a bit of friction in there to prevent people from just freely getting onto the show. And that waiting list also gives you the opportunity to proof check people. So anybody who's not a good fit, you just maybe need to have a conversation with them. Say, do you know what? Thank you for applying to the show, but you haven't been successful on this occasion. Please apply again in the future. Currently we're full, or something like that, right? Like there's always a way that you can diplomatically let people down, because you will always get people applying to be on the show who you've maybe thought would be a good fit initially, but then they aren't. And it also allows you to track who's booked a recording session for the show versus who's registered and just kind of is waiting for that moment. Or maybe you don't want to invite them all at once. You know, there is the other problem that if you get too many people saying yes at the same time, they all book recordings at the same time, and all of a sudden you're snowed under and all you're doing is recording podcasts. So that is another thing to consider at the beginning, is how are you going to manage that process? And my advice is just keep it simple. You know, I give people that link to the job form before they become a guest on the show. Only when they've filled that in do I consider them further or do anything else with it. Once they've created it, I will have a look, make sure they're a good fit, and then I'll create some promotional graphics on Canva, which is just basically a template, send them that out and ask them to book a link to record their episode. Guest questions is another one. Like, what kind of questions do you want to be asking your guests? And that research of your guests before they record is really important. And I wish I'd started doing that earlier in the podcast process, because it has really made a difference to the caliber of guests I get on and the caliber of questions I'm asking them. So it's not so much organic in the moment and everybody gets asked different questions. It's very much a structured process that is kind of similar questions, but you're still open to take it where you want to. So consider that as well before you get started. What questions would I like to ask my guests in an ideal conversation? Where do I want to go with this? If I was being interviewed, what would I like to hear from me? And because remember that when you get people on your podcast, you're doing two things. You want to make them look like a rock star. You want to elevate their credibility to their audience and your audience, because that makes you look good. It makes the podcast look good, and it creates more reciprocity from them, which means they might become a client if that's possible. They might be a partner for you, or they might actually just want to refer some people who are within their network. So make sure when you invite a guest that you're setting up the agenda for the day. Tell them when you come on the podcast recording link, here's what it's going to look like. Here's how many minutes we're going to spend roughly talking about X, Y, and Z. Here's some questions for you. Here's the bio I'm going to introduce you with, and send them all that well in advance so that they can review that and consider it. Most people just take it on face value and are appreciative that you're so well organized. Again, it just gives you the ability to more or less automate a lot of these things, right? I will download a guest's LinkedIn profile. You can save to PDF from their LinkedIn page. Combine that with the bio that I've already been given on the job form, send it into an AI and say, write me some questions for my guests based around X, Y, and Z. And it does a really good job of doing it for me. I'm not going to lie. I rarely have to change anything in there. Templated email already set up, ready to go with the questions in. And all I have to do is add their email address, change their name, double check it for any mistakes or obvious challenges, and send it out to them. So there's a lot of food for thought here, right? And this is live, right? So I'm not going to lie, this is live. So this is going to kind of dry up shortly in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So if you're out there and you've got a question, you want to ask anything, feel free. I can see you in the comments. We'll answer questions live around how you can get started before you get to the technology point. What do you need to create or think about before you actually get rolling? So we've covered off graphics, graphic design, the assets that you might need, your media kit as a podcast. We've covered off who you want to target for guests and audience and why. The why of your show and how you can differentiate your podcast or series from anybody else that's out there. The format of your show. So is it going to be 15 minutes? Is it going to be 30? Is it going to be 5? Some people do 5-minute podcasts, right? Like there are lots and lots of ways to differentiate yourself. And the other thing to think about is, can you create, and we talked about a media kit at the beginning, and there is a thing called like a podcast media kit where you can define who your audience are on a single page kind of Canva infographic, right? It might be a photo of you at the top, the name of your podcast, here's what we're doing, here's the description of the podcast, here's the sorts of people we're aiming at for guests, sorts of people we're aiming at as audience. And as the podcast goes on and you get some stats and figures that you can quote to people, then you can put those numbers along the bottom to try and encourage new guests or sponsors even to come and join the show. And that brings me on to one last point that I'm going to make before I open the floor to any further questions, right? Is sponsorships. Everybody wants to think about sponsorships. And I would challenge that that's not a realistic monetization strategy for a podcast, for most business to business podcasts, right? Certainly not in the early days. Maybe in a longer term strategy, yes. But what I'd advise is if you ever plan to become sponsored, you need to start thinking about it from day one and measuring the things that your sponsors might want to see so that you can showcase how you've grown over time. It's not about millions and millions of views. A really great example that I did for a client was we did a podcast where they were sponsored, and we put in a tracked URL into the call to action in the description of the page. So the client kind of talked about the sponsor during the episode and said, look, if you're interested in this technology, the link will be down below in the podcast notes. We put that right at the top of the podcast notes, and we tracked how many click-throughs we got from that. And from 5 episodes, their very first 5 episodes, bear in mind, probably not the most viewed or watched, and live for the rest of time, right? So that sponsor will always get click-throughs from those 5 episodes as people watch them. And they got 93, so to date, like I think it's in about 3 months of use, they've got 93 click-throughs, right? Now that doesn't sound a lot until you realize that this is quite expensive technology and it's very hard to sell that technology well, and it's got multiple stakeholders. And the client that I'm working with has a really engaged community. So the likelihood is that people who are clicking through, they're not just your average Joe who want to watch a podcast. They are clicking through because they're involved heavily in the industry and they want to know what it is that my client would recommend so heavily that she'd let them sponsor the show. So 2 things to take away from that is, 1, start tracking your metrics from the beginning. Don't become obsessed with them, but track them so that you can talk about them comfortably. Things like how many views, how many impressions, test click-throughs. So give them something for free that they can click through on. So you can talk about how likely people are to click through onto things. And average view duration, things like that from YouTube and things. There's loads and loads of really good analytics on most podcast platforms and on YouTube itself. Because one day you might need that for your sponsorship if you're ever going to do that. And a really nice idea that I borrowed from Chris Reeves, who's a good friend of mine. He's actually sponsored. So he's sponsored by a client and friend, but he's also sponsored by a charity. And I love this idea. I'm still working on who my charity might be, but being sponsored by a charity shows a level of professionalism and credibility that is hard to replicate. You don't need to ask anything of the charity. In fact, they're going to get things for free in return. And do not doubt how hard it is to get a charity to say yes to this. I'm still working really hard on convincing the right charities to say yes to our podcast. And it should be that way, right? It shouldn't be a simple decision. If they're a charity worth supporting, then you need to be able to work hard and demonstrate to them that this is worth doing. But I think it's also a really nice side effect of the podcast. It's you're doing something for nothing. You're giving something away, and again reflects really nicely on you from a guest and audience perspective, that you've got that power, that credential to be able to tick the box for that charity. So there's no questions popped up, so I'm assuming I've answered all of the questions that anybody who's kind of have had around launching their own podcast. But again, a lot of people watch this after it's being recorded. You know, we go live, it's dinner time. Some people can catch that, some people can't. If you're watching the show back later on, don't hesitate. Drop me a comment in the bottom, drop me a DM. This isn't about me selling what we do at Javelin, right? It would be great if I could find a couple of clients that want to have their podcast outsourced in some way, shape or form. I don't do the whole thing, so you still need to listen. But the majority of the point of this series for me is I speak to a lot of people who are just on the fence. They want to do a podcast, they have an idea for a podcast, and they just don't quite know whether it's for them or not. And this series is about getting you off the fence, getting you moving if it is suitable for you, or pointing out to you that actually, no, this really isn't suitable for you. Don't even consider it because X, Y, Z is too much, too far, not you, not your style. Fine. Like, let's get people off the fence one way or the other. So drop me a message, drop me a comment, send me an email. I don't care. I'm here to help. Thanks for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this live stream. We will be back, not next week, but the week after. Ooh, what are we going to cover? You'll have to find out. I'll drop the link in the comments below. Ta-ra.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of Podcasting Unlocked. This is a mini series. We're not going to go on forever, but I do want to give you enough information to be dangerous and get out there so that you can launch your own podcast successfully and stick with it. If all of this seems like it's a little bit too much and you'd like some support from somebody who knows what they're doing, who's done it before, then I'm here at your disposal. I take on 3 podcast clients per month, and one of those slots is currently filled. We are looking for potential clients for the remaining 2. And if you just want a bit of advice, then we can certainly sort you out with that as well. Thanks for coming along. Please do spread the word. And if you know anybody that is thinking of starting their own podcast or would be a good fit, please do invite them to the show where they can come along and have their own questions answered as well. See you next week. Bye-bye.